I remember in mid-June, you had pretty much predicted that the BOJ would not step in with bond trimming immediately, that they would wait till July to do so. They pretty much played by the script, but gave the market more. Now, do you think it was out of their own choice that they gave the market more, or were they just under so much pressure from all stakeholders that that's the way they had to go about it? Because it was out of turn for the BOJ to come out with an unexpected hike,
Right.
an unannounced, unprepared hike.
All right. So first, bless you for remembering that interview and the fact that the call was right. And second, on this call also, Tanvi, just to give credit where due, my Japan economist, for a week at least, was calling for the Bank of Japan to hike 15 basis points. If you remember the prior interview, right, I kept believing that the policy rate was what the Bank of Japan would use to signal things, right? Which is what they did. They were more hawkish than expected on the policy rate. I think you mentioned that it was a bit of a pivot. But when it came to QT, they were a little more dovish than the market expected. So I think overall it was a more hawkish meeting than expected. But there's a reason why the front end moved, but the back end really didn't in Japan.
Yeah, the front end, obviously, because they have moved on short-term rates, but now they're growing calls that they would get even more aggressive going forward. Do you think that is the case?
No. So the reason why everyone's now worrying about them getting more aggressive is because Ueda-san's press conference, right? He first said things along the lines of that 50 basis points, which is the terminal rate that they've gotten to in past cycles, doesn't have to be the upper limit. He hinted, like one of your colleagues mentioned, at perhaps another hike even this year, which the markets were not expecting. And he also said that real rates are still very, very low for the Japanese economy. All of this is talk. Ultimately, what will matter is the speed at which, the currency moves. Right now, for example, right, you can see in the Japanese equity markets that they liked the initial move, the currency stabilizing, stopping its weakening cycle against the US dollar. But now they no longer like it. We've broken through 150, and all of a sudden the Nikkei is off 3.5%. So I think for now, he's probably going to be, Ueda-san is probably going to be much more driven by what happens in the United States, to be perfectly blunt. And of course what happens to Japanese data. But I think the policy rate in Japan, to some extent, will be a function of how aggressively you get a U.S. easing cycle.
Ajay, an interesting trade that's come out of all of this is that, obviously dollar-yen and with the carry trade, and a lot of investors have obviously been piling into that, and some of those flows going into big cap tech with the carry trade unwinding. What would that mean for some of the juice that's been pumped into the U.S.?
Well, we've seen that, right? So until today morning, the NASDAQ was on the verge of its first correction in many, many months. So it never quite got there, but we were off by about 9% from our highs a few weeks ago. And you're absolutely right. I think at least part of it was that some of this buying of big tech in the US seemed to have been funded in cheap currencies, in funding currencies and the yen comes to mind first and foremost. And now you've had a vicious unwind. You've had a vicious unwind in FX carry trades, but you've also had a pretty strong unwind on the tech side. Now, I will mention, though, that the tech side seems to be stabilizing now. Along with this, and as you know, there's been this big rotation out of large cap into small cap in the United States. So US home builders, for example, are up an astonishing 25% this month, even as big tech is down. And nothing's changed fundamentally. That is just a rotation. That, I think, is done. And if that is done, I would think that the carry trade unwind is pretty close to its end. It's been very painful. The one thing that you could count on was that the sunrise in the east and that carry trades are supposed to work given the interest rate differential. So this, yes, took a lot of people by surprise. But I think we are close to the end of this unwind.